I am Karen Buck, and I'm president of Citizens for a Safe Environment. And we've been working in the East End of Toronto. We're a non-profit, incorporated community group who is trying to clean up the air and clean up the water so that we have healthy communities in Toronto. New evidence seems to suggest that fluoride can damage the brain. Researchers from around the world are convening in the GTA area this week to discuss the effect that fluoride is having on the brain. While fluoride has been shown to help prevent tooth decay when used topically, such as in toothpaste, studies are also showing that the addition of fluoride to municipal water supplies is having little effect on oral health. Instead, the recent studies provide mounting evidence that fluoride can adversely affect the neurological development of children. At this point in the press conference, I would like to introduce Dr. Paul Connett at the end of the table to my right. He's a PhD in chemistry. He's director of Fluoride Action Network. And for 12 years, he has been researching the peer-reviewed studies dealing with fluorides.
And I've worked with Karen Buck here for 23 years, fighting incineration and promoting recycling in Toronto. But for the last 12 years, as Karen said, we've been working on fluoridation. Now, the fluoridation debate has been controlled for far too long by the dental lobby. They see people something like that. They're preoccupied, they're dominated by one tissue, the teeth. Whereas the opponents of fluoridation, like myself, see the body slightly differently. We see things like brains and thyroids and stomachs and bones and so on. Now, I believe that Health Canada is not giving the citizens of Ontario or throughout Canada the truth on this issue. And that was illustrated by this recent panel report. Now, out of 6 people that were selected, so-called experts who were selected to look at this issue, 4 of them were dental experts and were known to promote fluoridation. We've dealt with these people in the United States. For instance, Mr. Kumar, Dr. Kumar, is a very well-known promoter of fluoridation. There was only 1 toxicologist out of 6 people on this panel. Now, Health Canada has just lowered the fluoride levels to 0.7, and that's seen by some as a victory. 0.7 parts per million seems small. It actually is very large if you compare it with the level in mother's milk. In fact, 0.7 parts per million is 175 times higher than the level in mother's milk. Now, they've lowered it because of concerns about dental fluorosis, but they've not acknowledged the 60-year-old fluoridation gamble. And that gamble is that you could damage the teeth and produce this thing called dental fluorosis by some systemic internal mechanism without damaging any other tissue in the body, the bones, the brains, the endocrine system. That was a gamble. They did not know that in 1950. And now they're supporting this. With its counterparts in the United States, are supporting this notion, this continued gamble, by not doing the studies. No studies have been investigated a possible relationship between fluoridated water and lowered IQ in children, arthritic symptoms in adults, underactive thyroid, increased bone fractures in children, earlier onset of puberty, Alzheimer's disease in adults, accumulation of fluoride in the pineal gland, and lowered melatonin production, and the fact that there are many reports of citizens being sensitive to fluoride. None of these have been investigated scientifically in Canada. The science hasn't been done. If you don't look, you don't find. And yet we have the Chief Dental Officer of Canada going to a community in Dryden, Ontario, and saying, I walked around your town, you've been fluoridated for 40 years, I don't see anybody with horns. I don't see anybody with horns. Well, that's a pretty pathetic statement, unscientific statement to come out of the mouths of a bureaucrat who should be protecting your health. Well, to get answers to these questions, the National Research Council spent this is the United States, an arm of the National Academy of Sciences, spent 3.5 years producing this 507-page report with over 1,000 references. And where did they had to go to other countries like India and China, which don't have the political constraints of having fluoridation programs, so they're allowed to do the science. And the science clearly shows that fluoride can damage many tissues in the body. And this is what the International Society for Fluoride Research has been doing for 40 years, looking at the health effects in these other countries. And they have their meeting in Mississauga starting today and for Friday and Saturday. And we have joined with the ISFR, that's FAN, to try to get this message to decision makers and to the public that fluoride does damage health. And the issue is really, is there an adequate margin of safety? Is there an adequate margin of safety between these effects that you can see in India and China and elsewhere, and the levels which you're going to be exposed to if you drink fluoridated water, if you drink a lot of fluoridated water and combine it with fluoride from other sources? And I believe, as a scientist, I would stake my whole scientific reputation on the fact that there is not an adequate margin of safety to protect everyone in society, which includes the very young, the very old, people who are sick, people who have poor kidney function, people who have poor diet, people that are borderline iodine deficiency. Look, if you're a health agency, you have to protect everyone, especially if it's your policy. You are promoting the addition of a highly toxic substance into the drinking water of every man, woman and child in your community, and you can't fudge it. You have to protect everyone, and you have to be on top of the science, and I'm sad to say that they're not. One of the scientists that we brought over here is Dr. Vivian Howard, literally one of the brightest people I know. He used to be the president of the Royal Microscopy Society. He is the current president of the International Society of Doctors for the Environment. He's an infant and fetal pathologist. And we brought him over especially to talk about fluoride's impacts on the brain. Before Vivian Howard, there was Arvid Carlsson. He led the successful campaign against fluoridation in Sweden. And he got the Nobel Prize in the year of 2000 for medicine. This is what he said in 1978. He says, "One wonders what an increase in the exposure to fluoride, such as occurs in bottle-fed infants." Remember, 175 times more fluoride in the water that kids are going to be drinking in Toronto and Ontario than in mother's milk. May mean for the development of the brain and other organs. Very prophetic. Since that time, there have now been 18 studies which have shown a decrease in IQ in children associated with fluoride exposure. And the full citations for all those works are in at this website. You can get it there, fluoridealert.org/brain, and also you'll find that reference in the handouts in the press kit here. The National Research Council concluded it is apparent that fluorides have the ill ability to interfere with the function of the brain. There have also been over 40 animal studies which shows that fluoride damages the brain. Now, meanwhile, you have these 6 experts that were brought together. Remember, 4 dental experts, 1 toxicologist, and 1 person, I'm not sure what he is. In the debate report, which is dated June 2007, 2 of these scientists said this NRC report did not report any effects between 2 and 4 parts per million on the immune, gastrointestinal, renal, hepatic, neurological, or endocrine system. That's absolutely false. There have been studies at less than 4 parts per million which show a lowering of IQ in China, and there have been studies less than 4 parts per million which have showed lowered thyroid function. In the recent statement that was put on the Health Canada's website in April of 2008 and hit the press a few weeks ago, this panel of 6 experts said, intelligence quotient, weight of evidence does not support a link between fluoride and intelligence quotient deficit. Well, I'd like to see their weight of evidence analysis. We don't have the report. We only have these very superficial conclusions. And at this point, I would like to hand over to an expert in infant and fetal pathology and ask him what he thinks about the weight of evidence of fluoride's impact on the infant and fetal brain.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here in Toronto. I'm a medical pathologist, and for the last 30 years I've been looking at the effect of chemicals on the development of the fetus and the infant. Now, classical toxicology is based on looking at adults in high dose responses. And what we've learnt over the last 10 years really is that if you look at lower concentrations at which what we call cell signaling molecules are being disrupted, then during the period of development you can find effects taking place at concentrations 100 to 1,000 times lower than required to produce an effect in an adult. So it's acknowledged by everybody in the field that the fetal period and the infant period are a period of special vulnerability. So what we also learned is that we get our genes from our parents, and that these genes express themselves, but during that expression there are mechanisms which can be involved by environmental factors. And this has consequences for what we become. So with that backdrop, let us ask ourselves, what is the level of fluoride in human milk? There's always been fluoride in the environment throughout our evolutionary history. But it seems that the breast has got a special exclusion mechanism. And we have to ask why. There's a paper here by Ekstrand, and she showed that if you challenge, these were human volunteers, a mother or female with fluoride injection, you'll see a peak in the blood, but you will not find it in the breast milk. But if you looked in other secretions, such as salivary glands, you would find a similar peak. So my interpretation of this is that there's a special mechanism which we have evolved to keep fluoride away from the young infant. There are 18 papers which have been reviewed and which I'll be presenting some data about at the meeting tomorrow, which show changes in IQ from populations exposed to fluoride compared to those exposed to either very little fluoride or a lower level. This was the results from one of the papers by Zhang, and it's for males, and you can see that for the distribution of IQs there's a shift to the left. And if you look at what that might mean on a population basis, the thing is, if you look at an individual, you will never really know that they might have been 5 points higher on the IQ scale. And for the majority of people, that will not be detectable in the way they live. But if you look on a population basis, here in a population of 260 million that's being modelled, you'll have about 6 million people who are highly intelligent, we can call them gifted, and you'll have about 6 million people with an IQ of less than 70. And they have problems living in modern society, they are a burden on the state. And now if you shift this 5 points to the left, this distribution, what happens? Well, now you see that you've reduced the gifted population to 2.4 million from 6 million, and you've increased the mentally retarded population, the problematic area of our population, by 57%. And this is really the message, is that if we, by what we are doing, we are playing with the population's intelligence, then we shouldn't be doing it, because it has enormous consequences for our society and for our health system. The weight of evidence that I've seen so far indicates to me that there is a problem with fluoride and its activity, particularly on the developing brain. There are two possible mechanisms for this. One is that fluoride is known to affect the levels of thyroxine, a hormone which is essential for brain development. And indeed there are studies by Hop and others which have shown that even looking within the normal range of thyroid level, if you compare the offspring of women who are at the upper level of that range with those that are at the lower level of range, you can detect a difference in the IQ of the offspring. So we're dealing with a very, very sensitive system. And on the balance of evidence that I've seen, I think there is a case, a very strong case, for the precautionary removal of this mass medication via drinking water.
Thank you, Vivian. And you have to ask yourself, I think, on a risk-benefit analysis, what parent in their right mind would put the development of their child's brain second to the development of their child's teeth, even assuming the fluoridation worked, especially when you have alternatives available. If fluoride works on the outside of the teeth, it's topical, and you've got fluoridated toothpaste readily available, universally available, it simply does not make sense to put it into the drinking water. Now, ordinary people, citizens can work this out. In fact, I'm dealing with citizens all over the world, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, Ireland, England, Canada, throughout the United States, who've worked this out, who know more about this issue than our medical and dental establishments, because they are trapped. They are trapped. They think this is the sacred cow of dentistry. And they think this is their huge contribution to public health, and they just will not look at the evidence. And I want to hand you over now to a real archetype, if you like, of a citizen who's educated herself, who's now educating the local decision makers, the local public, Cindy Mayer from Hamilton, Ontario.
My name is Cindy Mayer, and I've been involved with a group called People for Safe Drinking Water for the last year or year and a half, and we're interested in making sure that water in Ontario or in Canada is as safe as possible. There are risks that are becoming more evident with community water fluoridation, and we think that Ontarians and Canadians have a right to be well informed on this issue. Some of the points I want to just cover are the dose versus concentration level. It's something that the Public Health Service tends to get a little bit confused with, and we tend to be confused with that as well. And can we control the dose, and is it safe for all of us? These are the concentrations of artificially fluoridated water in some areas of the United States. Has a wide range depending on the state. Health Canada in the past has advised 0.8 to 1.0 parts per million, and this new report that Paul spoke about is going to ask them to reduce it to 0.7. Now, that's the sort of redundant advice in Ontario, because the Ministry of the Environment is also recommending levels of fluoride as well, and back in '99 they recommended that we drop that level to 0.5 to 0.8, and most communities in Ontario are already fluoridating between that level. Most of them that I've spoken to are fluoridating at around 0.6, so we're already fluoridating at less than Health Canada is going to have as a new recommendation. And the problem with that is that we're still seeing children that are under 8 years old that have been fluoridated at this lower level for the last few years and still have dental fluorosis. So it hasn't solved the problem at the lower level. There is fluoride in almost everything that we eat and drink. Those fluoride levels, I have some data here if anyone's interested in having a look at it after. I also have a database for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they have listed numerous foods, processed and fresh foods, so that you can find out the level of what fluoride content is in our foods. Toothpaste concentration is much stronger. We're not meant to swallow it. It's about 1,000 parts per million, and it's meant to be used for topical application. There's also some unknown concentrations of other exposures that we can't have in our diets, pesticides, fertilizers, air pollution. There are numerous pharmaceuticals that have fluoride content in them, and most people aren't aware of that. And there's lots of household and industrial chemicals that we're exposed to on a regular basis that have fluoride in them as well. So that's a little bit about concentration. It's just basically a measurement of the fluoride level in products in water. I'd like to talk about dose a little bit now. Back in the 1940s, when Dr. Dean, the original researcher that discovered that naturally occurring calcium fluoride could prevent some dental cavities, he recommended around 1 milligram a day. So if you fluoridated the water at 1 part per million, which was the upper limit of what Health Canada has just recently been doing for the past few years, and you drank 1 liter of water a day, you would get that 1 milligram of fluoride. So basically, Dr. Dean had said 1 milligram a day might be beneficial. Around the same time, there needed to be upper limits established as to what was a toxic dose. Dr. Harold Hodge in those days was the person who did these studies. He said that 10 to 20 milligrams a day for 10 to 20 years would be the toxic dose. Now my question is that, first of all, I think most of us are going to drink fluoridated water for more than 10 or 20 years. So if there's a lower dose for a longer period of time, will that be of concern as well? And we don't know that because proper chronic toxicological studies have not been done. So technically we're still in the experimental stage after 60 years. The average dose is about 3 to 5 milligrams a day, and that's supported by numerous reviews that have been done, including the fluoride in drinking water review that was Dr. Connett had spoken about before. There are several factors that are important in determining fluoride overdose. It's not just the quantity of how much you drink and eat in a day that contains fluoride, but also how well your body eliminates toxins. So if your kidneys aren't working 100%, you'll probably have more toxic dose than the average person. It's also influenced by your nutritional status. So if you're deficient in calcium, vitamin D, magnesium, iodine, those are all things that can factor in how toxic the dose is going to be to your body. About 50% of it is stored in our bones over a lifetime, so it is cumulative. And the dose is relative to body size and age. So babies consume a lot more water per body weight. So babies are technically getting a more toxic dose than adults would be. And if you went to your doctor to get a drug, the dose that he would give an adult as opposed to a baby would be quite different. Health Canada and the public are concerned with the fluoride dose from toothpaste if you swallow it accidentally. We're not meant to swallow toothpaste, but it happens, especially if children are not used to the spitting process when they're young. They're going to be labeling the packages of toothpaste next year, similar to what's been done in the States already. So that if you swallow more than is required for brushing, that you should call poison control. That's of interesting information to me, because we talked about the fluoride level in toothpaste is about 1,000 parts per million, but when you just take a little pea-sized amount, it equals a dose of about 0.25 milligrams of fluoride. Now that's equal to what's in a glass of water if you're fluoridating your community at about 0.8 parts per million, which is what Health Canada had been recommending previously. So I would like to know why Health Canada is concerned that I or my child may swallow some fluoridated toothpaste and call poison control. But if I'm on even the lower limit of what we're ingesting in a day, we're getting somewhere between 3 and 5 milligrams of fluoride a day. If I have 10 times that, which would be 2.5 milligrams of fluoride a day from drinking several glasses of water in the food, they're not concerned about that. They're concerned about the toothpaste, but they don't seem to be concerned to warn us that we shouldn't be drinking a glass of water, or perhaps several a day. And Public Health Service control how much we eat and drink. It's unlikely that they can do that. Lots of us can't control how much we eat and drink ourselves. So I don't know how they're going to tell us who's overdosed and who isn't. The National Research Council, as Dr. Connett had pointed out, there's many things that they did in this review, and they established people that are risk groups. And so there are certain groups in the population, like young children, people that are sensitive to fluoride, people that have diabetes and kidney disease, and then people that ingest large amounts of water, people with thyroid problems or insufficient nutrition. These are all risk groups, and we should be considering these when we're considering giving fluoride to all of the population. This is the group that concerns us the most. There have been several issues, warnings issued in the last few years from these associations. Health Canada's answer to that, they haven't been widely informing parents that they shouldn't be using fluoridated water for baby products and formula. Their answer is that they're approaching fluoride or formula manufacturers so that they can reduce the level of fluoride in their products. The only problem with that is they're not informing the public. And most of us, if we're purchasing formula, purchased one that needs to be reconstituted with water. So you're going to take the fluoride, the formula that they've produced, which has maybe little or no fluoride, but you're going to go home and you're going to use tap water to add to that. Parents don't know that they're not supposed to be using fluoridated water for children, and they should be told that. This is a very unfair policy of making the statement but then not informing people. So I'd just like to, ask the question, if we can't control the dose, and we've seen there are numerous groups at risk, particularly babies and young children, then how safe is water fluoridation for all of us?
And I think that underlines what bad medicine that this is. Apart from one short experiment with iodine, we've never used the public water supply to deliver medication for obvious reasons. You have no individual control. There's no oversight for the individual by any doctor. As Cindy has said, you cannot control the dose, you can't control who gets it, and you're also forcing it on people that don't want it. It's a very, very poor medical practice, and it's time it came to an end.
There is a list of people that I phoned and emailed and invited to come and speak and to support and to defend the practice of water fluoridation. And out of all of those people, there was no one who was available to be there on Monday. The people who are the ones who want the water or want the fluoride out of our water are the researchers who are looking through the microscope, who are seeing the actual effects that are being created by the fluoride dose. And these people have come to communities to say the research is showing this, and we are suggesting that you should learn as much as you can, understand how water fluoridation impacts you, so that you can get politicians and you can get the health officials to remove the fluoride from our water.
Dr. Brennan, you run down a list of diseases with negative outcomes, and I'm assuming, were you alleging that fluoride is associated with all of those, and then you're running down?
Okay. Now, the list I gave are very plausible connections with fluoride based upon animal studies and based upon what we've seen in other countries. What I think is absolutely unacceptable and atrocious is that countries that have practiced this for over 50 years, like Canada and the United States, are not checking these relationships. There's no study in Canada which has looked at lowering IQ as a function of drinking fluoridated water. So the list I gave you is, we're not looking to see if we can see a lowering of IQ as a function of drinking fluoridated water, or bone fractures in young children. There's a study done in Mexico which found a very strong relationship between the severity of dental fluorosis, which we know is related to fluoride exposure, and bone fractures in children. Very strong relationship. No one's ever tried to repeat that. Jennifer Luke found that fluoride accumulated in the pineal gland. No scientific body in Canada has attempted to reproduce that, to check to see if fluoride is accumulating in the pineal gland, or to do the next obvious thing, is to see if there's melatonin lowered in the population. Another thing that we know is that the first symptoms of fluoride's damage to the bone is identical to arthritis. There's 68 million Americans with arthritis. We don't know how many of those Americans might have had that condition either caused by fluoride exposure or exacerbated by fluoride exposure. We don't know because we're not looking. We also have countless stories of individuals who complain of symptoms, it's in many cases not life-threatening symptoms, rashes, headaches, nausea, gastrointestinal problems, and so on. And when they stop drinking the fluoridated water, the symptoms clear up. Then when they start drinking again, they come back. We've had published case studies. No attempt in Canada has been made to investigate, to put this on a scientific basis. These people are left to sink or swim by themselves. There's no government oversight. And I wouldn't mind if this was a voluntary thing, but this is your policy. Your policy is to put this known toxic substance into the drinking water, and you're not doing the absolutely essential, responsible thing to check out to see if that's causing harm to your people. Instead, all we get is these panel of, quote, experts who rubber stamp the policy. And I'm afraid the conclusion you come to is that these agencies are more interested in protecting this policy than they are in protecting the health of the people.
Just to clarify, you're not saying that fluoride, you're not saying that it caused that. You're saying we just don't know whether it does or not, right?
Let me clarify. There's two questions, if I can bifurcate them. Does fluoride cause these problems? Absolutely. Fluoride lowers thyroid function. Fluoride damages the bone. Fluoride lowers IQ. All of these have been demonstrated in India and China. The issue is there an adequate margin of safety from the doses where this occurred in India, China, Kenya, and other countries, and the doses that we are going to be exposed to drinking fluoridated water? That's the key issue.
And if you're going to then ask too, you mentioned that it's ineffective in doing what you want it to do. You said, right? You said it was ineffective.
Ingesting fluoride, yeah.
Why then? What is the reason do you think that the dental lobby, as you identified, has such a powerful sway over this issue? Because you don't seem to be getting a lot of traction.
Well, I think we are getting a lot of traction. I think we're getting a lot of traction now that we can put the studies on the internet. They can't be hidden anymore. We're doing it with videotape, we're doing it with the actual studies themselves and the arguments. So we're making a lot of traction around the world. I think the problem for the dental community is twofold. For your average dentist, they don't have time to read the literature that I do. I studied this for 12 years, I'm now retired, I can read everything that's published on this. The average dentist cannot do that. So they take the word from their professional bodies, and that's where you see these professional bodies are locked into this sacred cow. This is what gave them, for many dentists, this is what gave them respectability. They see this as their contribution to public health, and they don't want to see this practice flushed down the drain. However, I think they've got an out. We're giving them an out. We're saying, look, there's new evidence. There's evidence that you weren't aware of. How many of you, when you went to dental school, knew that fluoride might lower IQ in children? I would suggest that nobody knew that when they went to dental school. So they don't have to eat humble pie. They just say, in the basis of the new evidence, two pieces of new evidence. One, it could damage the brain. That should be enough. The other piece of new evidence, and this was conceded as recently as 1999 by the Center of Disease Control, they said in 1999, we used to think that fluoride worked by ingestion before the teeth had erupted, that it was a systemic thing, that you needed to give it to mothers and babies before their teeth erupted to strengthen the enamel before the teeth had erupted, so it would protect them from acid attack. And then in 1999 said, whoops, that theory is wrong. We now know that not enough fluoride is incorporated in the enamel systemically to protect the teeth. It works topically. And I think the moment that you can see that this works topically, that is the moment that you shouldn't put it in people's drinking water.
Can I just add two things to that, just briefly? Firstly, the agent that's put into the water, sodium hexafluorosilicate, has never been tested toxicologically. So if you think about what's required to license a drug and all the phases that it has to go through, this substance has never been tested formally, toxicologically. And the other thing is that the scientific basis which was used to introduce fluoridation, which got the World Health Organization to agree to it, is very shaky indeed. And the UK government formed a panel called the York Review to look at the evidence on which fluoridation is based. And they basically came along and said there wasn't a single paper that would pass a modern Cochrane review, which is the yardstick by which these things are done. So the basis for its introduction is poor. The toxicology that is required has never been done.
They continue to promote this thing, even though they cannot find, listen, get this, they cannot find a difference in tooth decay in 12-year-olds between fluoridated countries and non-fluoridated countries. This is World Health Organization data. Tooth decay has been coming down as rapidly in non-fluoridated countries and fluoridated countries. And if you go to the United States, if you look at it on a statewide basis, there is no relationship between the quality of children's teeth and the percentage of the population drinking fluoridated water in each state. So they don't have this evidence, and yet they nitpick issues which should obviously wave a red flag. I mean, when you have 18 IQ studies, 18 out of 20 studies from Mexico, from India, from Iran, from China, 18 studies says it lowers IQ in children, and there's levels as low as 1.8 parts per million And with a small population study, that is not an adequate margin of safety to protect the whole population. At some point, somebody in Health Canada must say, isn't this an issue for the precautionary principle? Are we really going to insist upon continuing, possibly damaging the brains, the bones, the thyroid gland, the pineal gland of a whole population until we get 19 studies, or 21 studies, or 23 studies, or until finally somebody in Canada gets round to doing the studies that they should have done 50 years ago. And I'm not picking on Canada here, by the way. The United States is far worse. Yes, yes.
I know you kind of touched upon this, but in an ideal world, what would you want the Canadian government to do right now? What would you say to them if they say somebody, a representative was sitting in front of you? What would you tell them to do right now?
I would say immediately stop fluoridation. I mean, this is a policy, when the political will is there, this is easier to stop as turning off a tap. I, as an environmentalist, I would be so thrilled if the other issues that I was dealing with were as easy to stop as turning off a tap. This is something that we're doing to ourselves. We don't have to do it to ourselves. There are better alternatives. There are safer alternatives. So just turn off the tap.
If that happened, nobody's going to die.
Yeah.
It's not one of those problems.
Yeah. And of course, you could do what they did in British Columbia, you could do what they did in Cuba, you could do what they did in East Germany, you could do what they did in Finland. After they stopped, they tracked tooth decay in their children. And the tooth decay didn't go up, it continued to go down. And so that would be a good experiment. Stop it and see if there's an increase in tooth decay. I don't think you will find an increase in tooth decay.
And if that doesn't happen, what should the person at home be doing right now?
Well, I think the person at home should be getting pretty angry with Health Canada. I mean, I expect politicians to spin. I think we've all grown accustomed, especially if we live in the United States, as soon as they open their mouths, they're spinning, they're lying, they're massaging, they're doing something but telling you the straight truth. But when you're a bureaucrat, you're a civil servant, they're working for you, they're working for me, they're working for all these people in the room, they're working for our children. We don't expect them to massage the data. We don't expect them to give us anything but the best science that's available. And that's what the bureaucrats should be doing to the presidents, the prime ministers, and all the decision makers. They shouldn't be the ones who are spinning. If the politician is absolutely in love with water fluoridation, when he gets the straight poop from the bureaucrats, let him spin it if he wants to. But it shouldn't be the bureaucrats who start this process.
So one of the main troubles with this is that it proposes a one-dose-fits-all. And that's patently not the case. It can't be. And so if you're having fluoridated tap water, you have to have a mechanism which stops us from fluoridate making up formula, because that's the most vulnerable time of life. And that if this damage that we're seeing in these studies to the brain actually is happening, and I certainly believe it is, that's when it'll happen.
And it makes it very difficult for communities once you realize that the research is showing this, and when you have researchers getting together and putting out this National Research Council report, which starts putting a different light on fluoride, it's really very difficult for communities who aren't given the privilege of having scientists and researchers come and speak to them. Because look what happened to us. We were turned down in having a debate between the researchers and the policy people. And we are thrown, as citizens, we're thrown against the wall. We need those experts that are coming on Monday, and hopefully there will be a lot of the public to hear it, but we need that kind of evidence brought to communities so that we can start saying, you know, the fluoride should come out of the water, and our politicians should take that evidence and make sure that they are voting to take the fluoride out of our water. Very much for being here. And I am Karen Buck, and I'm president of Citizens for a Safe Environment. And we've been working in the East End of Toronto. We're a non-profit, incorporated community group who is trying to clean up the air and clean up the water so that we have healthy communities in Toronto. New evidence seems to suggest that fluoride can damage the brain. Researchers from around the world are convening in the GTA area this week to discuss the effect that fluoride is having on the brain. While fluoride has been shown to help prevent tooth decay when used topically, such as in toothpaste, studies are also showing that the addition of fluoride to municipal water supplies is having little effect on.
And the issue is really, is there an adequate margin of safety? Is there an adequate margin of safety between these effects that you can see in India and China and elsewhere, and the levels which you're going to be exposed to if you drink fluoridated water, if you drink a lot of fluoridated water and combine it with fluoride from other sources? And I believe, as a scientist, I would stake my whole scientific reputation on the fact that there is not an adequate margin of safety to protect everyone in society, which includes the very young, the very old, people who are sick, people who have poor kidney function, people who have poor diet, people that are borderline iodine deficiency. Look, if you're a health agency, you have to protect everyone, especially if it's your policy. You are promoting the addition of a highly toxic substance into the drinking water of every man, woman and child in your community, and you can't fudge it. You have to protect everyone, and you have to be on top of the science, and I'm sad to say that they're not. One of the scientists that we brought over here is Dr. Vivian Howard, literally one of the brightest people I know. He used to be the president of the Royal Microscopy Society, is the current president of the International Society of Doctors for the Environment. He's an infant and fetal pathologist, and we brought him over especially to talk about fluoride's impacts on the brain. Before Vivian Howard, there was Arvid Carlsson. He led the successful campaign against fluoridation in Sweden, and he got the Nobel Prize in the year 2000.
Oral health. Instead, the recent studies provide mounting evidence that fluoride can adversely affect the neurological development of children. At this point in the press conference, I would like to introduce Dr. Paul Connett at the end of the table to my right. He's a PhD in chemistry. He's director of Fluoride Action Network. And for 12 years, he has been researching the peer-reviewed studies dealing with fluorides.
And I've worked with Karen Buck here for 23 years, fighting incineration and promoting recycling in Toronto. But for the last 12 years, as Karen said, we've been working on fluoridation. Now, the fluoridation debate has been controlled for far too long by the dental lobby. They see people something like that. They're preoccupied, they're dominated by one tissue, the teeth. Whereas the opponents of fluoridation, like myself, see the body slightly differently. We see things like brains and thyroids and stomachs and bones and so on. Now, I believe that Health Canada is not giving the citizens of Ontario or throughout Canada the truth on this issue. And that was illustrated by this recent panel report. Now, out of 6 people that were selected, so-called experts who were selected to look at this issue, 4 of them were dental experts and were known to promote citizens being sensitive to fluoride. None of these have been investigated scientifically in Canada. The science hasn't been done. If you don't look, you don't find. And yet we have the Chief Dental Officer of Canada going to a community in Dryden, Ontario, and saying, I walked around your town, you've been fluoridated for 40 years, I don't see anybody with horns. I don't see anybody with horns. Well, that's a pretty pathetic statement, unscientific statement to come out of the mouths of a bureaucrat who should be protecting your health. Well, to get answers to these questions, the National Research Council spent 3.5, this is the United States, an arm of the National Academy of Sciences, spent 3.5 years producing this 507-page report with over 1,000 references. And where did they have to go to other countries like India and China, which don't have the political constraints of having fluoridation programs, so they're allowed to do the science. And the science clearly shows that fluoride can damage many tissues in the body. And this is what the International Society for Fluoride Research has been doing for 40 years, looking at the health effects in these other countries. And they have their meeting in Mississauga starting today and for Friday and Saturday. And we have joined with the ISFR, that's FAN, to try to get this message to decision makers and to the public that fluoride does damage health. Fluoridation. We've dealt with these people in the United States. For instance, Mr. Kumar, Dr. Kumar, is a very well-known promoter of fluoridation. There was only one toxicologist out of 6 people on this panel. Now, Health Canada has just lowered the fluoride levels to 0.7, and that's seen by some as a victory. 0.7 parts per million seems small. It actually is very large if you compare it with the level in mother's milk. In fact, 0.7 parts per million is 175 times higher than the level in mother's milk. Now, they've lowered it because of concerns about dental fluorosis, but they've not acknowledged the 60-year-old fluoridation gamble. And that gamble is that you could damage the teeth and produce this thing called dental fluorosis by some systemic internal mechanism without damaging any other tissue in the body, the bones, the brains, the endocrine system. That was a gamble. They did not know that in 1950. And now they're supporting this with its counterparts in the United States. They're supporting this notion, this continued gamble, by not doing the studies. No studies have been investigated a possible relationship between fluoridated water and lowered IQ in children, arthritic symptoms in adults, underactive thyroid, increased bone fractures in children, earlier onset of puberty, Alzheimer's disease in adults, accumulation of fluoride in the pineal gland, and lowered melatonin production, and the fact that there are many reports